The Alabama moon hung like a bloodshot eye over Jefferson County on Christmas Eve 1859. When 7 plantation masters disappeared into the earth, they had forced others to work. While church bells rang across the valley and families gathered around warm hearths, something darker stirred in the iron ore mines that had made these men rich. 7 graves. 7 demons dressed as gentlemen. 7 silences that would echo through generations. The newspapers would call it the most shocking crime in Alabama history, but they never printed the real story. They never mentioned how Samuel worked those mines like a surgeon, precise and methodical, his hands steady as stone. They never wrote about the ghosts he carried or the promises whispered in slave quarters. They only wrote about the horror of white men buried alive, not the decades of black bodies buried in unmarked graves. Samuel wasn't born a killer. He was made one, carved by whips and shaped by loss, until revenge became as natural as breathing. Tonight we follow him into those dark tunnels where justice wore workman's clothes and carried a miner's lamp. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Whitmore plantation house glowed like a beacon against the December cold, its windows spilling golden light across manicured grounds. Inside, crystal clinked against bone china as 7 plantation owners celebrated another profitable year. The scent of roasted goose and honey cakes drifted through rooms warmed by fires that never dimmed. These men had built their fortunes on iron and blood, their minds extracting both ore and life from the Alabama earth. Master James Whitmore raised his glass, his face flushed with bourbon and satisfaction. Around his mahogany table sat the county's most powerful men, plantation owners who had diversified into mining, doubling their wealth while their slaves worked above and below ground. Their laughter bounced off silk wallpaper as they toasted their prosperity, never noticing how the shadows seemed to lean closer, how the very air grew thick with something ancient and patient. Beyond the gleaming windows, in quarters built like afterthoughts, a different world existed. Here, children shivered under thin blankets while mothers hummed lullabies that sounded like prayers. The smell of fatback and cornbread couldn't mask the odor of fear that clung to these walls like smoke. Every creak of wind, every distant shout from the big house sent tremors of anxiety through bodies already broken by the day's labor. But tonight, something had shifted. The very darkness seemed to pulse with intention, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In the space between celebration and suffering, between master and slave, a reckoning was taking shape. The ancestors were stirring, and their chosen instrument was sharpening his resolve like a blade against stone. Samuel moved through the quarters like a shadow-given form, his bare feet silent against the cold ground. At 43, he carried the weight of 2 lifetimes, the boy who had arrived in chains from Virginia, and the man who had learned to read power's vulnerabilities like scripture. His hands, scarred from decades of mining, had once been gentle enough to birth calves and heal wounds. His grandmother had taught him the old ways, which roots stopped bleeding, which herbs brought sleep, which combinations could stop a heart as quietly as a whispered prayer. He had been 15 when they sold his wife Rosa to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. She had been carrying their first child, her belly round with promise, when Master Whitmore decided she was worth more as breeding stock elsewhere. Samuel remembered every detail of that morning, how she sang while braiding her hair, unaware it would be her last sunrise in Alabama, how her eyes went wide when the trader's wagon appeared, how she reached for him as they dragged her away, her fingers grasping air where his heart used to be. The child she carried would be 24 now, if it had lived. Samuel pictured him sometimes, tall like his father, gentle like his mother, free in ways neither parent had ever been. But those dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford. Instead, he carried grief like a tool, sharp and purposeful, letting it cut away everything soft until only determination remained. 28 years in these mines had taught him their secrets. He knew which tunnels echoed footsteps, which chambers swallowed sound completely. He understood the weight of earth and timber, how pressure built and released, how a man could disappear into darkness and never return. Most importantly, he had learned to watch and wait, to study the patterns of his oppressors like a hunter tracking prey. The 7 masters who dined tonight had taught him well, though not through kindness. Whitmore, who sold children from their mother's arms. Harrison, who broke spirits with calculated cruelty. Montgomery, whose hands wandered where they didn't belong. Each had contributed to Samuel's education and hatred, and tonight, that education would bear its final fruit. Samuel had been planning for months, but tonight the plan would unfold like a prayer answered. He moved through his preparations with the patience of someone who understood that justice, like iron ore, required proper refinement. In the tool shed behind the quarters, he gathered what he needed: rope that wouldn't break, cloth that wouldn't tear, implements that served multiple purposes. The lamp oil was easy to acquire. Miners always needed light in the depths. The powder came harder, saved grain by grain from blasting operations, accumulated over weeks of careful scavenging. But the most important tool was knowledge, the understanding of each master's schedule, their habits, their fears. Harrison always checked the mines after dinner, suspicious of theft. Montgomery followed him, drawn by paranoia disguised as diligence. The others would come investigating when the first two failed to return. Samuel had studied each man like a scholar studying text, memorizing their cruelties as lessons in necessary violence. James Whitmore had purchased Samuel's grandmother when she was too old to work, promising her easy duties, then worked her to death in his tobacco fields within 2 years. Thomas Harrison had introduced the practice of whipping children as young as 8 for minor infractions. Robert Montgomery's violations of slave women were legend, whispered about in quarters across 3 counties. William Crawford had invented new torments, forcing slaves to dig their own punishment holes, then burying them to their necks in summer heat. David Thompson sold families deliberately, taking pleasure in their anguish, collecting tears like other men collected coins. George Patterson and Samuel Fletcher had pioneered the practice of renting slaves to other plantations for the most dangerous work, keeping profits while others bore the cost of death and injury. Each profile burned in Samuel's memory like a brand, fuel for the fire that would consume them all. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he prepared. Tools arranged like surgical instruments, each positioned for maximum efficiency. Tonight the Manchurian, as that had swallowed so much slave blood, would swallow something else entirely. The Christmas Eve air bit sharp as Samuel descended into the earth, his lamp casting dancing shadows on tunnel walls. Behind him, carefully concealed, the 7 masters followed their predictable patterns. Harrison first, his boots heavy on wooden planks. Montgomery close behind, whispering concerns about missing equipment. The others would follow within the hour, drawn by curiosity that would become their coffin. Samuel had chosen Chamber 7, deep enough to muffle screams, isolated enough to prevent escape. Here, the earth pressed close like a conspirator, and the darkness felt alive with ancestral presence. He positioned himself in the shadows and waited, his breathing steady as the rhythm of picks on stone. Harrison's lamp appeared first, bobbing like a firefly in the blackness. His voice echoed off stone walls, calling for Montgomery, unaware that Montgomery was already breathing his last in Chamber 5. The rope came swift and silent, catching Harrison's throat with the precision of long practice. Samuel's hands, strengthened by decades of labor, showed no mercy to hands that had shown none. Blood darkened the tunnel floor like wine spilled at a cursed feast. Each death came methodical, personal, a settling of accounts written in flesh and bone. The masters who had treated human beings like inventory learned what it meant to be counted, catalogued, disposed of with the same casual cruelty they had dispensed for decades. Samuel felt no pleasure in their terror, only completion. This was not revenge, it was restoration, a balancing of scales that had tilted toward evil too long. When Crawford begged for mercy, Samuel whispered Rose's name. When Thompson promised freedom in exchange for life, Samuel mentioned the children sold south. Each plea for clemency met with the memory of unanswered cries from the quarters. The earth received its offering without juice and engagement, swallowing voices that had commanded others to suffer. In the perfect darkness of Chamber 7, 7 demons dressed as gentlemen learned what powerlessness tasted like. They had taught Samuel how to endure, how to survive, how to hate. Now he taught them how to die. By dawn, the big house buzzed with panic. 7 prominent men had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. Sheriff's deputies searched every building, every field, every possible hiding place. They dragged ponds and combed forests following trails that led nowhere. The mines remained untouched for 3 days. Who would think to look there during Christmas celebrations? Samuel continued his regular duties, his face betraying nothing of the night's work. He hauled ore and set timbers, his movements unchanged by the weight of 7 lives on his conscience. Other slaves noticed his stillness, the way he seemed to carry himself straighter, but they asked no questions. Some knowledge was too dangerous to voice. When they finally found the bodies, the discovery sent shockwaves through Alabama society. 7 respected businessmen buried alive in their own mines, their faces frozen in final terror. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. Samuel's knowledge of the mines made him suspect. His lack of alibi made him guilty. The trial was theater, not justice. Samuel stood in shackles before men who had profited from his labor, his dignity intact despite their attempts to break it. When asked why he had committed such horrible crimes, he gave an answer that newspapers refused to print. "They taught me how." His execution drew crowds from 3 states, white faces eager to see justice done to the slave who had dared strike back. Samuel walked to the gallows with the same steady pace he had used in the mines, his eyes fixed on some distant horizon only he could see. The rope that ended his life was crafted from the same hemp that had bound his people in chains. But death could not kill what Samuel had become. In slave quarters across Alabama, his name became a whisper behind the stove, a story told in coded language when masters slept. Children learned of the man who had balanced the scales, who had shown that even the most powerful demons could bleed. His legend grew with each telling, transforming from historical fact into something larger, a promise that resistance was possible, that even the most oppressed could find ways to strike back. The mines themselves became objects of fear for those who had once felt invincible. Plantation owners began checking locks twice, posting extra guards, sleeping lighter. They had learned that wealth could not purchase safety from those they had wronged, that privilege was no protection against justice deferred but not denied. Samuel's ghost walked those tunnels long after his body was buried in unmarked ground. Workers reported strange sounds, unexpected breezes, the feeling of being watched by eyes that had seen too much. The Chamber 7 became a shrine of sorts, a place where the oppressed came to remember that they were not as powerless as they seemed. What violence lies buried beneath our prosperity, whose cries became the seasoning for our feast? Samuel's story reminds us that every empire built on suffering carries the seeds of its own reckoning. His hands, which had known only labor and loss, became instruments of a justice that legal systems refused to provide. He transformed from victim to agent, from property to force, of nature, showing us that the human spirit, when pressed beyond endurance, can reshape the very earth. The Alabama soil still holds his memory, and the memory of all who suffered. Their stories live in the wind that moves through old mine shafts, in the shadows that dance in abandoned chambers, in the strength of those who refuse to be broken. Samuel became more than a man. He became a whisper behind the stove, a reminder that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the only justice available is the kind we create with our own hands. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. It really helps the channel keep bringing real stories that never make it into the history books.